무조 진진 미묘호 야그센 만고난솔글 가곤 겐몬 도그즈지 강겐요라이 신지쓰기 무조진진 미묘호 야그센 만고난솔그 가곤 겐몬 도그즈지 강겐요라이 신지쓰기 무조진진 미묘호 야그센 만고난솔그 가곤 겐몬 도그즈지 강겐요라이 신지쓰기. Today I want to take a break from the Gyorji chapter and talk about something different. Probably you already got the screenshots I sent you, about 3 pages from a book of Thomas Merton. I think the title is New Seeds of Contemplation. Anybody here who has never heard about Thomas Merton? Oh. So only Edward knows who Thomas Merton is. I'm a little bit surprised because he used to be quite famous in the Western meditation scene. So when did he die? Around in the early 1970s or so? Maybe 76 or so. I'm sure there's a Wikipedia page on Thomas Merton. Well, he's famous because he started out as a Catholic priest. I forgot which order, but as a Catholic monastic, and also started to write books on Catholic monasticism and contemplation in the Catholic tradition. And I think this book, where these screenshots are from, are one of his earlier works from the 1940s or so, I think, or maybe early 50s. And then later in his life, he became interested in Buddhism, and he also had friendship with D.T. Suzuki, and was one of the first Catholics that were kind of actively seeking an exchange with Buddhist monks and Buddhist meditators. In Germany, there's quite a few Catholics who are into meditation, or actually the first people in Germany that taught Zen were Catholics. Like the most famous is a guy called La Salle. Pater LaSalle, who came to Japan, I think, in the 1920s. And in 1945, when the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima, he was quite close to the epicenter at the time. So he survived the Hiroshima atomic bomb. And after that, he got interested in Zen and actually was somehow, I think, an authorized Zen master and at the same time Catholic monk. And most of the year he lived in Japan, but he also went back to Germany at least once a year to teach Zen in Germany. And right now there's a few Catholic priests that are active as Zen teachers in Germany. And I think much more Catholics that are interested in Zen. For some reason, much more Catholics than Protestant Christians, as far as I can judge. And Thomas Merton is an example of an American, or I think he was born as an Englishman. So he was an Englishman, but then he went to America to become a Catholic monk. So he was most of the time active in America, and I think he died in Bangkok, where he was to participate in some kind of a conference of religious leaders. And I think he was, how do you say, electrocuted? There was some electric fan or so that fell in his bathtub, I think. And there's even some rumors that he was killed by the Vatican or so, that there was a plot to kill him. So because he was drifting too much in the Buddhist direction, but I think he was just not careful enough, and this fan dropped into the bathtub when he was having a bath, and he died. Anyway, so Thomas Merton used to be quite popular in the meditation scene in the West. In the 70s and also still in the 80s when I got into Zazen. And among these screenshots which I sent you, probably the most famous part starts at the end of page 194. The most dangerous man in the world is the contemplative, who is guided by nobody. He trusts his own visions. He obeys the attractions of an interior voice, but will not listen to other men. He identifies the will of God with anything that makes him feel within his own heart a big, warm, sweet interior glow. And if you Google for the first 2 or 3 sentences, you find these quoted all over the net in a lot of different contexts. And a lot of people take what Merton is saying here in a positive sense. And I think if you look only at this quote, it actually sounds quite cool what he says here about the contemplative being the most dangerous man in the world, being even more dangerous than, say, Che Guevara or whoever could be there. Because he's guided by nobody. So he doesn't allow anybody to brainwash him. All of us others are brainwashed by the media, brainwashed by commercials, by the internet. But if you become able to be so self-reliant that you're guided by nobody, then you become actually the most dangerous man in the world. You trust your own visions. So who's guiding you then? And that's then the third sentence. You obey the attractions of an interior voice. rather than listening to other men. And there is within your own heart a big, warm, sweet interior glow, which you identify with the will of God. So realize that God is not something out there, far from you, above the clouds, but you discover God in yourself. And it's not just an abstract idea, but you can actually feel the will of God in yourself, and it feels, well, big, warm, and sweet. It's glowing. But then when you continue to read, you realize that Thomas Merton is aiming at something else here, is trying to say something else that at first sight he seems to say. The sweeter and the warmer the feeling is, the more he is convinced of his own infallibility. And if the sheer force of his own self-confidence communicates itself to other people and gives them the impression that he is really a saint, such a man can wreck a whole city or religious order or even a nation. The world is covered with scars that have been left in its flesh by visionaries like these. However, very often these people are nothing more than harmless bores. They have wandered into a spiritual blind alley, and there they rest in a snug little nest of private emotions. No one else can really bring himself either to envy or admire them, because even those who know nothing of the spiritual life can somehow sense that these are men who have cheated themselves out of reality and have come to be content with a fake. They seem to be happy, but there's nothing inspiring or contagious about their happiness. They seem to be at peace, but their peace is hollow and restless. They have much to say, and everything they say is a message with a capital M. And yet it convinces nobody. Because they have preferred pleasure and emotion to the austere sacrifices imposed by genuine faith, their souls have become stagnant. The flame of true contemplation has gone out. When you are led by God into the darkness where contemplation is found, you are not able to rest in the false sweetness of your own will. The fake interior satisfaction of self-complacency and absolute confidence in your own judgment will never be able to deceive you entirely. It will make you slightly sick, and you will be forced by a vague sense of interior nausea to gash yourself open and let the poison out. In order to understand the true value of spiritual obedience, we must be very careful to distinguish between self-will and genuine liberty. This distinction is a matter of great importance because we are called to freedom under obedience and not to the mere sacrifice of all freedom in order to respond to authority like machines. The highest freedom is found in obedience to God. The loss of freedom lies in subjection to the tyranny of automatism, whether in the capriciousness of our own self-will or in the blind dictates of despotism, convention, routine, or mere collective inertia. One of the most common of illusions is that by asserting my own caprices against the dictates of authority, I am manifesting my own freedom. I am acting spontaneously, in quotation marks. This is not true spontaneity, and it does not lead to genuine freedom. It is license rather than liberty. Of course, even this imperfect spontaneity may be in itself preferable to the dead routine of passive conventionalism, but this should not keep us from seeing its obvious limitations. And this is where the screenshots end, I think. And, well, maybe I'll also read the part that comes before the famous quotes, starting on page 192. Far from being essentially opposed to each other, interior contemplation and external activity are two aspects of the same love of God. But the activity of a contemplative must be born of his contemplation and must resemble it. Everything he does outside of contemplation ought to reflect the luminous tranquility of his interior life. To this end, he will have to look for the same thing in his activity as he finds in his contemplation, contact and union with God. No matter how little you may have learned of God in prayer, compare your acts with that little. Order them by that measure. Try to make all your activity bear fruit in the same emptiness and silence and detachment you have found in contemplation. Ultimately, the secret of all this perfect abandonment to the will of God in things you cannot control, and perfect obedience to him in everything that depends on your own volition, so that in all things, in your interior life and in your outward works for God, you desire only one thing, which is the fulfillment of his will. If you do this, your activity will share the disinterested peace that you are able to find at prayer and in the simplicity of the things you do. Men will recognize your peacefulness and will give glory to God. It is above all in the silent and unconscious testimony to the love of God that the contemplative exercises his apostolate. For the saint preaches sermons by the way he walks, and the way he stands, and the way he sits down, and the way he picks things up and holds them in his hand. The perfect do not have to reflect on the details of their actions. Less and less conscious of themselves, they finally cease to be aware of themselves doing things. And gradually God begins to do all that they do in them and for them, at least in the sense that the habit of his love has become second nature to them and informs all that they do with his likeness. Maybe first about this first part. Merton, he talks about two aspects of what we would call practice. Contemplation, which in our case would be zazen, sitting still, doing nothing for an hour, and then getting up to walk quietly for 10-15 minutes and then sit down for another hour. And sometimes we do that for 5 days in a row. But then there is cleaning, there's samu to be done, work to be done. Sometimes there's a study group like this. And Merton says these are two aspects of the same love of God. So it's not that one is more important than the other. And sometimes in Zen there's a discussion about, well, which in the end is more fundamental. Is Zazen more basic and we only do Samu to support our practice of Zazen? But it would be ideal if we could spend the whole year doing a session and somebody else would do the work for us. Or sometimes, especially in Rinzai, it says that actually Samu is 1,000 times more important than Zazen, because in Zazen sometimes you only think that you're practicing while in fact you're only dreaming, while in Samu you have to be in the moment, or it's obvious if you're not. But I think the common understanding in Zen is that actually the 24 hours of the day are practice, and in each moment you do basically what you do. And if you sit, you sit. If you eat, you eat. If you take a shit, you take a shit, and it's all the same practice. We don't talk about God so much in Zen, or basically not at all. But what he's saying here talks about contact and union with God. Ultimately, the secret of all this is the perfect abandonment to the will of God in things you cannot control, and perfect obedience to Him in everything that depends on your own volition, so that in all things, now that's at the top of page 193, so that in all things in your interior life and in your outward works for God, you desire only one thing, which is the fulfillment of His will. If you do this, your activity will share the disinterested peace that you are able to find in prayer, and in the simplicity of the things you do, men will recognize your peacefulness and will give glory to God. It is above all in the silent and unconscious testimony to the love of God that the contemplative exercises his apostolate. For the saint preaches sermons by the way he walks, and the way he stands, and the way he sits down, and the way he picks things up and holds them in his hand. Basically, what Merton is talking about here is what in Zen, in Japanese we call mui, and in Chinese it's wu wei, non-doing. Non-doing, of course, doesn't mean that you don't do anything, but whatever you do, I think in somewhere in the other practice papers, I say, let the walk walk, let the talk talk, something like that. If you do cleaning, it's soji itself that's doing soji. When you do zazen, zazen does zazen. In Samu, sometimes you get to the point where you don't have to think anymore about what you do, but basically you do what needs to be done in that moment. Or sometimes when you're tense and you're very busy, you get to the point where your hands and feet, they just move and they do everything just in the right way, so that lunch is on the table at 12 o'clock. I think that's what he's talking about, just following the will of God. We wouldn't use that expression, but sometimes there's this condition where things just take care of themselves, and it's not that like you're acting like a robot in the sense that you would be lifeless. You're completely aware and present in that moment, but in a way you could also say that there's something else that's taking control of you. So sometimes people, when they talk about mindfulness, they say we live our ordinary lives in this autopilot mode. And what I think they try to say is that when you're in this autopilot mode, is that you're, I don't know what the pilots do in the cockpit when the plane is flying into autopilot. Maybe they're chatting with each other, maybe they're holding a nap. Basically, the computer in the cockpit is taking care that the plane is flying in the right direction at the right height at the right speed. So the pilots don't have to be so aware in that moment. Still, sometimes when I hear this expression that you're living your life in autopilot, it reminds me of this feeling, for example, when Zazen is doing Zazen. It's like sitting Zazen in autopilot, but what is different is you're completely aware in that moment. It's just that you give control to Zazen. It's not that you try to control Zazen. And the same can happen during Tenzo or Samu or Soji, whatever. Obvious examples when you're taking a shit and sometimes maybe you've got constipation. You're doing your best to get it out. But then you just have to let go. In that moment, things take care of themselves. And sometimes in other aspects of life, it works the same. You're trying your best and you make a big effort and you still can't do it. And the moment you let go, you realize, oh, especially like in Zazen, what Dogen Zenji calls Shinjin Datsulaku, letting go of body and mind, is a little bit like this moment where you were constipated and then there's this moment of release and something drops. Can happen in Zazen as well. I think that's what Merton calls here with the following the will of God. And also, we haven't read that in a while in Antaji, but sometimes in the winter we study the Tenzo Kyokun, and other winters we study the Chiji Shingi, the standards, monastic standards for the Zen community, is I think the English translation we have it in the library. And somewhere there is an exchange between, was it Chakujo? Maybe. There's a visitor that comes to Hyakujo, a famous Chinese monk who lived more than 1,000 years ago. He's famous for saying a day without work is a day without food. So sometimes he's credited with starting the self-sufficient style of living Zen practice. So this visitor comes to Hyakujo and says, I know this very auspicious mountain. I think the name was Isan. That's the name of the mountain. And if someone would build a monastery on that mountain, I'm sure lots of people would come there to practice. Hyakujo, do you know anybody who would be capable of building a monastery on that mountain? And Hyakujo says, well, how about me? And the visitor says, well, you're a little bit old. Maybe somebody younger than you would be better. And then Hyakujo calls the first monk. And the visitor says, well, can you take a few steps and clear your throat? And the first monk takes a few steps and clears his throat. And the visitor says, no, that person is no good. And next, Hyakujo calls the Tenzo, the cook, and he does the same. And the visitor says, oh, that's the person, that's the guy we were looking for. And the first monk later is then very, angry, or his pride is hurt. How can you judge me and the Tenzo just by having us walk a few steps and clearing our throats? And then Hyakujo says, well, if you say that, let's take a second test. And he puts a vase or something in front of the two people and says, well, how would you call this object without calling it a vase? And the first monk says, well, you can't call it a cup of tea. And Hyakujo just kicks it with his foot. And then both Yakujo and the visitor agree that it's the Tenzo. It's not Yakujo who kicks it, the Tenzo. I think Isandeyu also was later his name. Maybe I get the names wrong. But anyway, the cook just kicks the vase all over the place, and he gets the job. So he gets the job of building a monastery on that mountain. So often it's enough to just look at a person, how he sits, how he stands, how he's cleaning the floor, and often the attitude with which a person does something teaches much more than what that person has to say when he's sitting in the spot and gives a Rinko talk or whatever. So Merton uses different expressions than we usually have in Zen, but basically what he's talking about here is non-doing. The extreme difficulties, now I'm reading the end at the bottom of page 193. The extreme difficulties that lie in the way of those who seek interior freedom and purity of love soon teach them that they cannot advance by themselves, and the Spirit of God gives them a desire for the simplest means of overcoming their own selfishness and blindness of judgment. And this is obedience to the judgment and guidance of another. A spirit that is drawn to God in contemplation will soon learn the value of obedience. The hardship and anguish he has to suffer every day from the burden of his own selfishness, his clumsiness, incompetence, and pride will give him a hunger to be led and advised and directed by somebody else. His own will becomes the source of so much misery and so much darkness that he does not go to some other man merely to seek light or wisdom or counsel. He comes to have a passion for obedience itself and for the renunciation of his own will and of his own lights. Therefore, he does not obey his abbot or his director merely because the commands or the advice given to him seem good and profitable and intelligent in his own eyes. He does not obey just because he thinks the abbot makes admirable decisions. On the contrary, sometimes the decisions of his superior seem to be less wise. But with this, he is no longer concerned because he accepts the superior as a mediator between him and God and rests only in the will of God as it comes to him through the men that have been placed over him by the circumstances of his vocation. And now this connects to the famous quote about the most dangerous man. It's clear that Merton's idea of a contemplator, meditator is different. So that for him, obedience is central. And this connects, for example, to what Dogen says at the end of Shobo Genzo Zuimonki, at least in the edition that we usually read. It's the very last chapter. Let me see if I can find it quickly on the internet. As you probably know, you can find it on the Soto Zen. It's 6:17, and I'm reading here from the internet. Shobo Genzo Zuimonki, Book 6, Chapter 17. Dogen instructed, there's a proverb about the emperor, about the way of the emperor. If one's heart is not empty, it is impossible to accept loyal advice. What this means is that without holding personal views, one follows the opinions of loyal ministers and carries out the way of the sovereign according to how things should be. The attitude of Zen monks practicing the way should be the same. If you hold on to personal views, even slightly, the words of your teacher will not enter your ears. If you don't listen to your teacher's words, you cannot grasp your teacher's Dharma. Forget not only the different views on the Dharma, but also worldly affairs and hunger and cold as well. When you listen, being completely purified in body and mind, you will be able to hear intimately. When you listen with this attitude, you will be able to clarify the truth and resolve your questions. True attainment of the way is casting aside body and mind and following your teacher directly. If you maintain this attitude, you will be a true person of the way. This is a primary secret. And Dogen says pretty much the same in the last chapter of the Gakudo-yo Jinshu, which we have lots of copies of an English translation. I think it's called Heart of Zen in the library. There's 10 chapters of the Gakudo-yo Jinshu, and in the last he also talks about casting aside body and mind. And here the translation is following your teacher directly. In the original Japanese, the character there is no teacher, but it's just ta, which means the other or the others. So basically you don't follow your own views, but you follow what the other person says. But then again, this also has something frightening. Somewhere in the Zuimonki also, or maybe it was the Gakudo-yo Jinshu, there's also this expression of the old nest. And Merton, interestingly, he uses the same expression here. The old nest that one falls. That's the old nest of your own opinions, views. Well, I don't know about how you read this, but it has something frightening. This insistence on obedience, and as he says there, you don't obey. You're not supposed to obey the abbot or the superiors because what they say is wise or intelligent, but just out of a desire for obedience itself. Frightening because, for example, in Germany we have the history of Nazism, National Socialism, and the reason why that was possible at the time is because people obeyed their superiors, and probably a large percentage of the population were aware that what was going on was not right. It's just that if I alone resist, it would cost my life and it wouldn't change anything. So what other choice do I have to just follow along and obey the orders? And that's how war starts. So Merton's insistence on obedience just for the sake of obedience, even when you realize that what your superior says is maybe not so wise in the end, it has something frightening. So I guess it needs to be balanced with a certain, well, wisdom on your side, or first of all, that's also something Godogen Zenji mentions or emphasizes in the Gakudo Yojinsu. You need to be sure that you're studying with the right teacher in the first place. So you need to first make sure that you're putting your trust in the right person. On the other hand, if each time your teacher says something that doesn't really fit with your own personal views, and you get out your yardstick and decide, is this really what I want to do, or is it not what I want to do, you will never finally be able to let go of that yardstick, which practice is all about, to once and for all let go this grip of my yardstick, and this is what I think is right and what I think is wrong, and this is what I want to do. If you don't let that go, non-doing cannot happen. There will always be this you that does things or that decides, this is what I want to do, this is what I decide I'm not going to do. You need at one point to let go of that, and if you have the guidance of another, it makes it much easier. Maybe once more to this quote about the most dangerous man in the world. The most dangerous man in the world is the contemplative who is guided by nobody. He trusts his own... I have problems with this computer. He trusts his own vision, I think. He trusts his own visions. He obeys the attractions of an interior voice, but will not listen to other men. All of you have seen the movie Matrix. The Matrix, yeah. I saw it, probably was not so long after it came out, at the end of the 90s, in a plane from Japan to America, so I wasn't so focused and I was tired. But the beginning I found interesting. I got bored when all these kung fu scenes started. But the beginning, this idea that you're living in a reality that's not really real. What you think is reality is not really real. You're living inside an illusion. It has something, it has parallels to lots of religions and philosophies, but there's also this parallel to Buddhism, that you're basically living in an illusion. Sawaki Roshi also talks a lot about this group paralysis, where we're living in this illusion that we share with everybody else. So there's this guy, I forgot the setup, but at one point he has to choose between two pills, a red pill and a blue pill, and the red pill will make him wake up from delusion, and the blue pill will make him forget everything that happened, and he's gonna go back into this illusion. And I think they even tell him that he might be even happier if he returns to illusion, takes the blue pill and returns to delusion, but then he decides to take the red pill, and he sees that he had been a slave to, well, the Matrix basically. And the Matrix we could identify in Buddhism with delusion. He had been a slave to his delusions until then, and he wasn't even aware of that. He thought he was in control of his life when in fact he was a slave. But then he wakes up, but he sees that all his fellow men are still in the illusion, trapped in delusion without realizing it. What I found a little bit, how do you say, well, missing in that movie was, well, I talked about that also on YouTube, but I think only in German a couple of weeks ago. 10 years before The Matrix came out, there was a movie with Schwarzenegger called Total Recall. Do you know that? Which is, well, it's a Schwarzenegger movie, so there's a lot of also action and fighting going on. What I loved about this movie is there's also the setup. There's this guy totally brainwashed and thinking, or living an identity that's not his real identity. And at one point he wakes up to this fact that, or well, at first he just thinks, I need to go to Mars, to the planet Mars for some reason. But then he realizes the woman that he thought was his girlfriend is not really his girlfriend, it's an agent that's basically spying on him. And he was trapped on Mars, not on Mars, on Earth. For some reason, people didn't want him to go to Mars. And when he goes to Mars, he meets his former friends who are basically rebels on Mars. They're fighting the system. They're fighting the people on Earth that try to colonize and control Mars. So he was one of the rebels on Mars that fought for the independency of Mars. He meets these friends again, and they somehow they remove this whatever was plugged into his head or whatever. They succeed in removing the brainwashing process. So he's basically in that situation where he has taken the red pill and he's woken up, he's seen through the whole delusion and he's back into his real self. But then there's this interesting turnaround when I think he gets, I forgot the details, but he gets caught again by these colonizers from Earth. And hey, don't you remember who you are? Oh, I see, these guys, these rebels on Mars, they brainwashed you. They made you think that you're one of these rebels. Why don't you sit on this chair and we remove that bug that they put into your brain? And then, so basically Schwarzenegger is in that situation where it's not clear anymore, is the red pill the real pill, is the blue pill the real pill? How can I be sure that the first brainwashing was actually a brainwashing, or maybe the second brainwashing, when I thought that I woke up from the brainwashing, maybe that was the actual brainwashing. So what I would have wanted in the Matrix movie is that at one point this I think Neo character and all his friends should have asked themselves, oh, maybe we are the guys who are living in the illusion. Who knows if maybe actually the red pill was the drug? How can we be so sure? And that question is especially well relevant today. And in the end of the 90s, kind of terrorism wasn't a big topic yet, but until after 2001. Being a minority that's fighting for the independence of your state or your group, whatever you are. In the 80s, in the 90s, that was still cool, but today you have the Islamic State, or I think they have a hard time now, but Islamic State, I think, attracted especially these people who thought we don't want to be slaves anymore of global capitalism and the rule of the Christian capitalist Western world. We want to fight that system. We want to fight this global matrix. But from the outside perspective, well, they are the ones that are brainwashed. But from their perspective, we who live in global capitalism, we are the ones who are brainwashed. And at the end of the day, it's hard to tell. It's really hard to tell. Anyway, Merton warns here against trusting your own visions and nothing but your own visions. I mean, Dogen Zenji also in the Zui Monkey warns against following the ideas of right and wrong that people in the world have. But then the question is, well, what do you follow then? If you're also not supposed to follow your own ideas. One reason I'm saying that, or actually I gave more or less the same talk already 3 years ago, so when none of you were here. I was giving more or less the same talk because I had the feeling at the time that some people at Antaiji are very serious about practice, and they have a very also maybe clear idea what practice is about, what they want to do here. But sometimes it's just a little bit off. Like there's this type of practitioner who want to meditate as much as possible. And in Antaiji, you have these 1,800 hours of Zazen, so that's great. And during the winter, when there's no Samu, they would maybe also sit in their room and meditate by themselves. And maybe even during Samu, they would try as good as possible to concentrate on their breath during Samu, so that they stay focused and don't lose sight of themselves. So they might weed the carrots, but would try to not get lost in this discriminative thinking of this is a carrot, this is a weed, but rather stay focused on I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out. And from the outside, sometimes it seems that this person, it's obvious they're really serious and they're aiming at something there, but they're not really connected with the work, especially when you look at them doing Samu or Soji. They're not really connected with the work. Their mind is somewhere else. In Japanese, there's this expression bo tosuru or boke tosuru, which means to be. What do you say in English? Well, it's maybe also absent-minded, but Well, the funny thing is that these people probably think that they are the least absent-minded. They're most they're actually actively trying to be as mindful as possible in each moment. It's just that their idea of mindfulness means that, well, they put their mind, for example, on the breath or whatever practice they do, and it's not, well, where the carrots grow. And when somebody tells them, then, hey, maybe you should, well, practice here with the rest of us. For them, it's more a disturbance of their practice. Or that there's the story of the guy who was given the task to weed the carrot fields. At the end of the day, he had removed all of the weeds, but all of the carrots as well. And the responsible for the vegetable field was angry and yelled at him, so what are we supposed to eat during the next winter? And he said, why are you so attached? Aren't we supposed to let go, and you're still caught in your discriminated thinking? And in a way, of course, well, he's true. I mean, we've left secular life because we want to get out of this. What can I gain? I don't want to lose. I want to gain. I don't want to lose. So why should we worry about the shika getting into the rice field or the vegetable fields? I mean, if they get into the vegetable field or the rice field and they eat something, then we lose something, they gain something. So where's the problem? Why make so much fuss about checking the fence each night? But then there's the reality of life here at Antaiji, and although it's not about individual gain and loss, to be able to sit on the cushion for 1,800 hours, somebody has to put the meals on the table. And the food has to grow in the fields. So also 3 years ago, I had the feeling there's sometimes people at Antaiji that probably feel a very big, warm glow in their heart, and they follow that, but it's somehow leading them a little bit off in a different direction from the rest of the Sangha. But whenever somebody, including myself, tries to tell them, hey, you're not really here, that probably sounds to them just like white noise, kind of something that's pulling them out of this feeling of being in the here and now. For them, they're always in the here and now, and it's this, well, useless task of having to separate the carrots from the weeds and removing the one and leaving the other, and making the tour around the electric fence and making sure that the shikas don't come in. That's actually disturbing their practice. There is a person that probably none of you, or maybe Eko-san wa Koike Ryunosuke-san wa kita koto aru. Eko-san knows him, but I doubt that the rest of you have heard about him. Well, in Japanese, or in Japan, he's quite famous in the spiritual community. Tsukiを書いて、ここはこうでこんな感じ。まあ竜 the dragon 竜の助。I'm not quite sure how old he is now. He's younger than myself, and well, the kind of interesting thing, he was born, or his father took over a Pure Land temple, Jodo Shin-shu temple in Yamaguchi. And so as the son of the temple priest, he was supposed to take over that Jodo Shin temple, which he was also going to do. And Jodo Shin Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, teaches basically salvation through the power of Amitabha Buddha. And none of us can save ourselves, but it's not really necessary because Amitabha has promised to save us. Amitabha has already saved us, and all we need to do is to chant Namu Amida Butsu as a sign of, well, gratefulness for the fact that we are already saved. And this Koiken Yunosuke was into, or is into, meditation, and started to meditate and visit meditation teachers both in Japan, and also he went to, I think, Thailand and maybe other places to participate in retreats, and it helped him a lot. And I think he was also writing about his progress on his blog, and he got into trouble with the Pure Land Buddhist headquarters. When he wanted to take over the temple from his father, they said, well, you can't become a Pure Land priest if you follow those teachings that you follow according to what you write on your blog. So you can't meditate, because meditating is basically the efforts to get closer to Buddha, which is also the reason why, well, I think both the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, sometimes they have problems when people who are Christians also meditate, because usually in Christianity you draw a clear line between humans and God, and you don't try to mix those. You're not supposed to try to get closer to God. The same in Pure Land Buddhism. So you leave salvation to Amitabha Buddha. You're not trying to get closer to Amitabha Buddha. You're not supposed to try to become a Buddha yourself. So he was told he couldn't become a Jodo Shin priest. So he made his temple, or his father's temple, become independent so that he could become the next priest. So he left Jodo Shin, the sect, and became the head priest of this temple in Yamaguchi Prefecture, which is at the west end of the main island. And also he started a second small temple close to Tokyo, where he started meditation courses. And he's written lots of books in Japan as well. So starting 10 years, 15 years ago. And he appeared on TV. That's probably what made him most famous. There was this Buddhist boom around 10 years ago in Japan, and they had this program called Gyoretsu no Dikiru, 法律
の相談所。
はいいや法律相談所の要するにパックリ両方ともそのためその時島田紳介がやったんですね。So there was this famous TV personality Shimada Shinsuke, and he had these two programs. One was maybe was something like that in the West as well, where people could. There were 3 lawyers or 4 lawyers, and you could ask them questions, and each lawyer was about law or something, or divorce or whatever, or traffic accidents. And each of the lawyers, usually what made the program interesting, each of them had totally different opinions about who is right and wrong in that case. So basically, there was a case that's presented, and people first there's some how do you say? Well, in Germany we call these prominente. What would be in English?
Prominence, a word in English.
Prominence?
Well-known.
Well-known people are like celebrities, kind of celebrity kind of people. They kind of discuss about that, and then they ask the lawyers. Usually, it's kind of right or wrong or whatever, and usually 2 of them say right, 2 of them wrong, and then everybody's surprised. Well, how why is that? Whatever. That was one of these programs, and the other one was the same with Buddhists. It started later, or Buddhist monks, like where people could ask questions about, well, either Buddhism or life in itself, and there were 4 or 5 Buddhists that would give their point of view, and he was one of these. He's a kind of funny character in that he resembles, I don't think we have this type right now here at Antaji, but this type of practitioner that also comes to Antaji, very serious, very also introverted. Sometimes they seem as if they have no desires at all. So probably he was very thin. So probably he was not eating much. Probably wasn't that guy who said that after 2 weeks or so, now I need a beefsteak, or I want to eat delicious ramen. So I want to go to Watanabe Suisan also. Rather the kind of guy who on a hosan, if he has time, would sit in his room alone and meditate for an extra 2 hours or so. Almost like the perfect hermit. Like I saw him only once on TV. I saw this program once, but obviously the time that they had told him that the program would last, or the time they would need to broadcast, to film the program, was longer than they told him. So he would get up in the middle of the program and say, I have to leave now because my meditation class is starting. For the rest of the program, there was this one vacant spot. He had just disappeared because he had this, I don't know, Friday weekend class or so. And everybody else was like, oh, doesn't he know this kind of golden time TV now? And he cannot go. But for him, it was completely normal. In a way, it was really cool. And last year, at some point last year, he says, he was a monk already in the, or he was acting as a priest in his temple, but he says, well, I'm gonna leave home once more. So I don't know what he did with his temple in Western Japan, but I think tried to sell this house that he had in Tokyo, and he stopped his meditation classes, and he was basically living like a homeless, just traveling barefoot around Japan and living in a sleeping bag. And I didn't read these books, but there was one book that he wrote with the title Gedatsu Sunzen, which means just before final nirvana. Gedatsu is kind of the liberation, final liberation of the Buddha, or nirvana. So one step before nirvana. And according to the internet, according to people who know him well, he was saying at the time that he would need a minimum of 1 year, a maximum of 7 more years to attain final nirvana. So he was basically entering the last stage of his spiritual quest. I'm not quite sure how old he is now. It's probably in his early 40s at the time, so around 40. He was acting as a teacher around the age of 30. For 10 years he was acting as a meditation teacher, but then he quit that last year to enter this final stage. And again, according to people who know him, he said that if you have the complete deluded person, and that's the 0, and Buddha would be 100, then he at the time located himself at 90 or so. So he was on a scale from 0, deluded person, to Buddha. He was at stage 90, and he thought, I need a maximum of another 7 years to climb this last 10 steps on the ladder. And now that was a little news in Japan, in the spiritual community, that around 2 weeks ago or so, he called his former publisher and tried to reach out to his former students, saying that, well, basically I was wrong. I fooled myself. I'm probably not going to become a Buddha during this lifetime. And I'm not gonna teach meditation anymore. All I want to do for the rest of my life is maybe, well, live together with a partner and take care of my parents in their old age. And I think he said something. You can. It's all in Japanese, of course. So if you look for Koike Yunosuke, you won't find anything in English, I think. But he put this also on YouTube. I don't know if he put it on YouTube by himself or if it was people close to him. But he put this voice recordings all together about 1.5 to 2 hours, I think, where he talks about the last 6 or 7 months when he was traveling, and the reason why he stopped the travels. And he realized that he's not going to become a Buddha. One of the things he says on YouTube is he thought that he had already gone beyond his sexual desires. So he thought he had left the sexual desires behind. But then, to his total surprise, he started to have wet dreams on his travels, and one night after the other, which was something that didn't happen to him before. Now, having wet dreams is actually one of the few things concerning sexuality which are in Buddhism completely okay. So never has the Buddha said that you must not have a wet dream. Everything else is basically forbidden. So you must not have sex with women, you must not have sex with men, you must not have sex with animals, you must not have sex with corpses, you must not put your dick into vegetables or whatever. It's really, if you look through these old Vinaya texts, they basically thought up every possibility. And there's this one famous case of a guy taking a nap in the park, and when he wakes up, there's a woman sitting on him and having sex with him. And then the Buddha, for some reason, says, "Well, you're not wrong. You're not to be blamed. You had a nap." So it was not your intention to have sex with this woman, so she's at fault. You're not wrong. Masturbation is also not allowed, but wet dreams is one of the few things which are completely okay, because I mean, it's happening to you when you're sleeping. It's not, your will is not involved in this. But I think there was a point in the early history of Buddhism. They had these 4 or so gatherings after the Buddha died. During the first 2 or so, they decided what the Buddha had said and put it down in writing. But then I think it was around the 3rd gathering there was a split in the early Sangha, and one of the points which they could not agree on is if an Arakan is basically a perfectly enlightened person, still has wet dreams or not. So one group said even an Arakan sometimes still has wet dreams, and another person says no, an Arakan is completely liberated, so an Arakan should not have wet dreams, and if he does, then he's not an Arakan. And I'm not really familiar with Southern Theravada Buddhism, which of these two is now the dominant view. But it seems that this person, Koike Nyunosuke, was surprised and also then devastated that he would have wet dreams, and one night after the other means I can't be at 90 if I still have wet dreams. Then, as he was walking barefoot around the country and camping in his sleeping bag, sometimes when it was raining, under the roof of a house came that people called the police, and he was stopped by the police and questioned by the police. And he thought that he was already so detached from himself that wouldn't really move. But then he felt that, this loneliness of being there on the street and nobody there knows him. あの人の名前は何だったかな、鉢巻きをして旅してる人知らない？なんかどこか山口県でなんか行方不明になった2歳児を見つけて。
大分のなんとかさんですよね。
なんか有名な人。
名前はおじさんでしょ。
そう、おじさん。
ボランティアをして歩いてる。
There's a guy pretty famous in Japan. I think 2 years ago or so, there was a 2-year-old kid that got lost somewhere in the mountains, and they were looking rescue.
夏じゃなかったですか？去年の夏。
去年の夏。
なんかあそこで見ませんでした。
佐世保で。見たと思う。
あ、2年前。
去年だったか、でも1年半前じゃない？まあまあ。So maybe it's half a year ago. Maybe it's 1.5 years ago. I think it was in the summer because we saw it on TV in Kyushu. A 2-year-old boy got lost in the mountains, and rescue people tried to find him. Nobody could find him. There was this comparatively old guy who went into the mountain and found him. And I think he said that basically he put himself in the shoes of this kid and thought, well, where would I go if I was a 2-year-old? And he went there and he found the kid. And after that, he was instantly famous. And he has this red towel that he wraps around his, I think he's bald also, he looks bald, he has this red towel. And I think now he's also traveling through Japan, camping on the street. And wherever he goes, people come to kind of hug him or shake his hands, and the camera follows him. So wherever he goes, people are happy to see him. And I could imagine this guy, wherever he goes, people are kind of, in Japanese, you would say kimoi, kind of, the girls say kimoi. This guy is kind of spooky, or kind of, he's really, exactly, yeah, that's the guy who's kind of famous. and people love him, and
そうだね、テレビで有名な
yeah, and young people, old people, everybody, they want his sign, they want to shake his hand, and well, that's the guy I'm talking about right now. Yeah, well, that's Koike Yunosuke, so kind of little different type of person.
あ、似てるってことですか？
いや似てない。
あ、
ただその旅をしてその野宿したことでそのまあ小池龍之介さんのはその一つ自分ががっかりしたというか驚いたのは無声をしたということ。それも連日着替えもないのに連日無声をすると。自分がもうあとまあ長くても7年以内に下脱するはずなのに無声するはずはない。で職務質問されるし、私の想像ではまあ裸足で歩くわけだから女子高生にはキモいキモいと言われたりとかそれがなんか悲しいというかそういう執着もないはずなのになんか執着が残ったというまあ産芸というのをまあ YouTube でも見れる。So you can, in Japanese, you can listen to him. So this person, and he has quite a great following, or his books sold well. So I think quite a lot of people are so kind of surprised that this person who was so close to Nirvana now says, I won't make it in this lifetime. On the other hand, you could also say, well, maybe this realization he had, maybe that is a sort of satori. Especially in the form of Buddhism where it comes from, Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism starts with that realization, I will never become a Buddha. That's why Amitabha Buddha has promised to save me. If I could become a Buddha by myself, there would have been no reason for Amitabha to save all living beings. But Amitabha Buddha has, especially for myself, who will never be saved through my own efforts, made this vow to save me. So in Pure Land Buddhism, this realization that I will never make it is already the thing that connects you with Amitabha. And then there's this famous section in the Genjo Koan, the first chapter in some editions of the Shobo Genzo, where Dogen Zenji says to awaken to delusion is what makes you a Buddha. Mayoi o daigo suru wa shobutsu nari. Buddhas are those who realize that they are deluded. Not the ones that realize that they have no delusion, but the ones that realize they are deluded. Those are the Buddhas. While it's the ordinary people who delude themselves into thinking that they're enlightened. Go o daime suru wa shujo nari. Again, you could draw a parallel there. That's maybe it's those who think they've taken the red pill and now they see clearly that are actually in delusion. And those who are totally aware of their delusion but are able to live with it are actually maybe the awakened ones. Well, if you're interested and you Google for this name in Japanese, you will go or you will find a page by the publisher Sangha, which is a Buddhist publisher. They have published several of Koike's books. They have also published 3 of my books. And one of the editors there relates of how he got a call in the middle of March from this Koike. And, well, Koike then says, sorry, I was, well, basically, I was lying to you when I said that I'm close one step to nirvana. I realized actually I'm far away from nirvana. So in a way you could say that realization is a good realization, but what I found strange in there is what the editor said is that when Koike talked to him on the telephone, he said, I thought I was already at 90 and I had only 10 more steps to climb so that I get to perfect nirvana. When we first met a couple of years ago, I was 28. And last autumn I thought I was 90, but actually what I now realize, I'm still at 30. Which for Koike is probably a big, well, surprise, and then a reason for this, in Japanese it's called sange. How do you say in English? In German we would say Beichte or Reue. Confession, yeah, confession. So, so basically, he calls his editor and says, "I have to confess something. I thought I was at 90. Actually, I'm only at 30." And in his mind, is several years passed from the time when he was at 28, and now he's at 30. So even if he should live for another 50 years, he will never get to 100 in this lifetime. But for me, at that point, it's clear that his realization is quite different from what Dogen Zenji says when he says realizing delusion is what makes you a Buddha. Because realizing delusion means that you let go of this yardstick with which you measure where you are from 0 to 100. In the world where that comparison is possible, which means in this discriminative world where we all have names and we all have passports and we all have different weight and a different length. In that world, we'll never be enlightened. We'll always be limited human beings. And when you realize that, you let go of that yardstick. So when you say, actually, I'm not at 90, I'm still at 30, you're still clinging to that yardstick. That's what's kind of, well, surprised me or made me think, oh, not a big difference to where he was last autumn, when he still thinks he's at 30. It's just that when we have this realization of being deluded and being deluded for the rest of ourselves, the important thing is someone has this realization. This realization is coming from somewhere. And this realization itself is beyond comparison. And this realization cannot be measured with this yardstick from 0 to 100. The moment you realize, I am deluded. I am this deluded person. I am this Muho with all his failures and with his desires and everything. But the person who realizes this is also at the same time beyond. So that's kind of what, well, surprised me about Koike, that he still well, obviously attached to the idea that, well, he's somewhere there in the 30 area. Another thing is the confession itself. You can, listen to it by yourself on YouTube. Me personally, so when I listen to what Koike has to say, for example, in my case, especially during the first years after I started with Zen practice, there were a lot of small revelations, and whenever I sat in the beginning, it felt special, completely different from the rest of the day when I didn't sit. It always felt good, or at least felt worth my time. I never regretted to sit, and it never felt as if it wouldn't make a difference. It always made a difference. And I felt as if I made progress. And when I came to Antaiji, I felt that I thought that I would make even more progress, because now I would have much more time to sit. I would have 1,800 hours per year to sit, and I would have my daily, not only my daily practice, but also my monthly session. And again, because it was so intense in the beginning, it was hard as well, but once I realized, I can do this, again, this realization was a great realization. I can do this. And with each session it gets a little easier. And at first I couldn't even sit in half lotus, even in the Burmese posture, moving around. But then at one point I finally can sit in half lotus, and then eventually I could, at least during the 4 hours during the day, I could sit in full lotus. Wow, now I can do that. But what was missing was, this great breakthrough, the answer to all the questions, this final thing that I came for. There was little steps forward, but there wasn't this big breakthrough, becoming a Buddha, nirvana. But then, there's this episode that I often talk about, dying on the third day of the session. Completely letting go, even if it should cost my life, and realizing it's not me, but there's Zazen that's doing Zazen for me. And around that time, I also sometimes had these revelations or periods that remind me of what people tell who have participated in Naikan retreats. Do you know about Naikan? No. So I think in Jodo Shin Buddhism, in Pure Land Buddhism, usually they don't meditate, but there's this one meditation style that was invented or developed by Pure Land Buddhists. I think what they do there is they put you into separate rooms or put you into a corner of a room, and you have a, how do you say that?
Partition?
Pardon?
Partition?
Partition, yeah. So basically you're isolated for several days, and you're told to focus on maybe on the first day from when you were born until age 4, and then from age 4 to age 8, from age 8 to age 12, and so forth. And during that time of your life, you're supposed to focus on the question, what have my parents, my mother and my father, done for me? What have I done for my parents? And what have I done that have caused my parents trouble? Or what in Japanese would be meiwaku. So what meiwaku have I caused for my parents? And what good have I done for my parents? And what good have my parents done for me? And one question that you could also ask, but which is not asked, is, well, what meiwaku have my parents caused for me? Which is sometimes what we are very obsessed with, or which is also what psychoanalysis focus a lot on. Like when I was young, my mother did this to me, my father did this for me. That's something that they don't ask in Naikan. It's the other way around. So how much of a pain in the ass were I for my parents, and how much good have I done for them, and how much good do they have done for me? And then also later in life you broaden that and also focus on other people. And basically what you realize then is you really haven't done much for anybody. Especially when you compare that to what other people have done to you, especially when you focus on your parents. Compared to what sacrifices your parents have done for you, that's really not so much you have done for your parents. And then if you also put into calculation what trouble you caused for them, you're really ashamed. And I never participated in a Naikan retreat, but also in the Zen, when you realize, or when I realized, wow, I'm sitting here. And while I'm sitting here, the Tenzo is making the meals. The meals are there on the table. There's a room for me. There's a futon ready for me in the closet. I didn't make that futon. It was already there for me when I came to Antaiji. And all these years before I came to Antaiji, and also these years and months I spent in Antaiji, most of the time I was complaining. I was complaining about this, I was complaining about that, I was complaining about my Dharma brothers, about my superiors, about this and that. the work, the weather, and I wasn't missing a thing. I wasn't missing a thing. And at that time, I felt like I wanted to confess, but I never confessed in that I would kind of, well, go on the internet or actually call somebody and say, hey, I've been lying to you. It was not me who was doing the Zen. The Zen was doing the Zen through me. So that's also a little bit, I mein, maybe I'm too much of a kind of cynical person, but when I listen to these YouTube talks of Koike-san, at one point I understand, or I think, at least I think I understand where he's coming from and what happened there. But then to go on the internet with it, and then even to say I was at 28, now I'm at 30 on the scale to enlightenment. There's something wrong, something smells wrong there to me. Probably I think Sawaki also said that somewhere in the quotes that we read in the winter, kind of a confession can also sometimes be like some kind of makeup that you put on a show by saying, oh, I'm such a bad person, I'm such a bad person, I'm such a bad person. But you don't really think you're a bad person. Hey, look at me, what a good boy I am, saying that I'm bad. I'm so sorry, I confess. Well, the reason why I spend so much time talking about Koike Yunosuke is because, well, it's a perfect example of this contemplative who could, well, lead at least some people completely astray, while for others he's a complete bore. The koan for us who are sitting here right now is how much are we willing to give of ourselves? And if you want to give all, you need to follow. And it's not enough to just follow an inner voice or an inner glow, but you have to follow others. Sometimes what others say is obviously not the best thing. Even in such a case, sometimes, if it's not so bad, if it's just that it's not the most, say, intelligent way to do the job, you can still say, okay, let's do it like that, and just for the sake of it, as a form of practice, do it like this. Sometimes if it's really dangerous and there are life at stakes, you also have to let go of this idea of unconditional obedience and say, hey, maybe this is dangerous. On the other hand, I think we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that, well, we are the ones who have taken the red pill and we know exactly where we're going and whom to follow, basically our own idea, what is right and wrong. Okay. So much from my side. You might, so I already read that small last portion of the Shobogenzo Monkey. You might also want to check with the last chapter of the Gakudo Yojinchu. And if your Japanese is good enough and you're interested in it, you could also Google for Koike Yunosuke. And you find some material on him as well. Okay, so much from my side for today. If you have any questions, please feel welcome to ask. 今回英語だけでしたが、何かご質問等ありましたらお願いします。はい。
You mentioned there was something you picked up on 3 years ago with the Sangha, which is why you chose to
Yes.
give this talk. Was there something specific now that you picked up on that you chose to do the same?
Probably it was less in the Sangha than basically this thing happening, Koike Yunosuke topic coming up. So probably you never heard of him, but as he's a trade name in Japan, so that's something that came up. So a lot of people right now on Twitter or in the internet are kind of discussing, well, what went wrong, or did anything went wrong? Maybe that was actually a great realization. As I said, you can also interpret that as a huge realization. I'm a deluded person. But it applies, I think, to a certain degree also to ourselves. I mean, we're here for practice, and even though we might not call it nirvana, I mean, we have some goal or some idea what we want. For example, well, the state of non-doing. We want to practice non-doing. But how do you do that? And right now, among the four of you, I don't see that type, but in the past, over and over again, there were people here that were more serious than the rest, but they were slightly off. Their mind was always slightly off. And I had the feeling they were in Antaiji mainly because it was convenient for them to practice here, because, well, they had this minimum of 1,800 hours and they had 3 meals a day. They had a certain amount of samu, but not too much. But they didn't come for spiritual guidance because they thought they already knew where they were heading. Which in a way is kind of not so bad, because in what I write in the adult practice papers is that well, you shouldn't hang on your teacher like kids hangs on their parents and always, well, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do? Please tell me what the practice is about. It's your practice. It's your practice. And you should know why you have come here. If you don't know, then even your teacher can't tell you, why am I here? if you don't give that question, if you don't give the answer to that question, who's supposed to answer that question? On the other hand, if you don't have ears to listen, and that's sometimes that happens, that people are so sure that they know what they want to do, and they are so sure why they are here. They already have that question answered in their mind that you can't even reach them anymore. Then why live together in a sangha? Any other questions? Yes, please.
Sort of interested in the whether or not we've taken the red pill or still living in delusion, or whether we've woken up or not. How do we sort of like, not that I think I have this problem, but then I think, oh yeah, I'm practicing the right way, but maybe other people think this person's practicing the wrong way. How do you sort of differentiate between what's what? I mean, you said it's hard to tell, but does it go any deeper than that?
I think as long as you realize I'm not that perfect, I'm actually more deluded than I thought I am, you're on the right track. Just like Savaki also says in the text that we studied in the winter. When you sit in the Zen, you become very aware of your illusions, or of that kind of bug that bites you on the testicles. When you were dancing with a geisha, you forgot about that. And some people complain that during the Zen they have more disturbing thoughts than usual, but it's not that because of the Zen your disturbing thoughts increase. It's you become more clear and settles, and you see this stuff more clearly. So when you have doubts if you're really progressing or not, then I think you're on the right track. While on the other hand you think, oh, I'm going the right way, everything is getting better every day, and I was at 39, 40, 50. Slowly but steadily I'm rising, then maybe something is wrong. But if you're not so sure, and that doesn't mean that you kind of phone all your friends and I'm such a bad guy, I'm such a failure, I wasted 2 years of my life in Antaji. I don't mean that exaggerated form of being not sure about what you do, but more like I mean, that's kind of what I found a little bit strange with the Matrix film. These red pill guys are too sure about themselves, too sure that they know the answer. And with Total Recall, well, in the end, Schwarzenegger also seems to be sure that, well, he belongs on Mars, but there's still room for doubt there, and that's what I like about this movie, that maybe actually he was brainwashed, just like people get brainwashed into ISIS, and they think that, well, ISIS is fighting for the right cause, but maybe one day they wake up from that dream. Or we are the ones that are brainwashed, and maybe in 50 years we're all Muslims, and we think back about that time. I was brainwashed into Zen Buddhism and thought I had all the answers. But now finally I'm here. And how do you say, up to Allah, or whatever. these respects as intended there. Yeah, as long as you have doubts, I think you're on the right track. Hmm.
すいません。
はい。
高圧のあれを報告という形で金額を上げましたので。
はい、メールで届きました。